Bull Holly exulted at the results of the carrier raid, though the next time they met the Admiral would complain to MacArthur of George Kenney's performance in the moment. He expressed himself quite clearly to Ted Sherman, signaling, "It is real music to me," and opens the stops for a funeral dirge for Tojo's rabble admiral. Nimitz, pleased to, immediately assigned Rear Admiral Alfred E. Montgomery's Task Group 50.3 to the South Pacific and directed that officer, who had fleet carriers Essex and Bunker Hill along with light carrier Independence, to make his best speed. Nimitz wanted exploitation, taking action with view earliest possible strikes, repeat strikes on damaged and other ships in and around Rabble, but a campaign of repeated carrier raids on the Japanese fortress proved unnecessary. Ultra revealed the Japanese heavy units withdrawing and Koga hunkering down at Tiaro on November 9. Spack modified his order to provide that Montgomery, after a single strike, should proceed to the Central Pacific for Nimitz's offensive. The last act of the Rabble drama took place in the air, with the evolving Bonneville campaign in the lead. The Japanese would actually fight 6 air battles of Bonneville in the course of their row operation. The air battles afforded Kosaka and Ozawa's pilots no greater success than the ineffectual attack on the American carriers following the November 5 raid, but JF losses were painful: 83 aircraft. Emperor Hirohito's satisfaction with the claimed but false US carrier losses in the Rabble raid continued when Admiral Nagano updated the palace on November 9. Hito joined Captain Gio for toasts in the aides duty office, but those combat results were illusory too. Throughout November, on 869 sorties flown, many of which were, however, fighter patrols over Rabble, the fruit was a single transport sunk and a few ships damaged. Holly's influx of South Pacific forces onto Bonneville proved more supple and enduring than Japanese efforts to blockade the island for the Marines. CBS and others on Bonneville, including the Japanese. There would be plenty of mud, mayhem, and misery, but enemy efforts to drive the Allies into the sea were no more successful than they had been on Guadalcanal. Imperial Navy support activities would be subject to the existing operational environment, now highly dangerous to the Japanese. The light cruisers left at Rabaul furnish a good example. The fleet ran a counter-landing mission to Torikina coupled with a supply run to Bua. Both succeeded. On the next Bua run, the Not Ori was torpedoed and left the Solomons for the last time. Again, like Cactus, the Japanese on Bonneville became isolated while action off Bonneville continued. George Kenney sent several more small air strikes against Rabaul and Bull Holly geared up for another big attack. That aerial assault took place on November 11. Kenney's follow-up strike was cancelled due to weather, which had also dramatically reduced his activities during the previous 48 hours. On the appointed day, Sherman flung his carrier planes at Rabble from the east and Montgomery from the south. Overcast hampered Sherman's planes, which got in just a small attack on a few ships they spotted through a break in the clouds. Montgomery's 199 aircraft stormed into Rabble through rain. Kosaka defenses put up 68 Zeros to contest the airspace in an echo of Santa Cruz. Jim Vosey, who had planted the damaging bomb on the Shikaku's flight deck that terrible day, was now a lieutenant commander leading the Bunker Hill dive bombers, but Voss got no major decision this time. Not only was the weather uncooperative, but the pickings were nothing like they had been. Most important of them was the Agano. She sighted the attackers at 8:57 a.m. Captain Matsubara ordered his flak gunners into action. 10 minutes later, at 9:12, Avengers began their level runs for torpedo attack. One tin fish hit the bow but failed to explode. Another struck the after section and detonated in crew quarters, leaving part of the structure dangling in the sea. Dive bombers achieved no results with the detritus acting as a stationary rudder. Matsubara lost steering control. The Agano had many casualties. Heavy cruiser Mirror, still repairing, emerged unscathed. The Yubari also rode at anchor. Captain Sakai Takumi's light cruiser saw the approaching planes at 854. Sakai ordered his main battery into action and got off 26 5.5-inch shells, but by 9:13 S planes were close enough to strafe the Yubari and several tin cans with her. The cruiser's luck held, and only a couple of seamen were wounded. The destroyer Suzuinami was caught while she was loading torpedoes. She sank near the entrance to Simpson Harbor. The Nagan Army reached Blanche Bay but suffered a torpedo hit and had to be towed back. Admiral Montgomery's instructions were to make a second strike. He had begun rearming when Kosaka struck back at least the JNF. Waves were detected on radar more than 100 mil away. Montgomery launched some of his follow-up strike planes beginning at 1:25 p.m., but shortly after that defensive action began to predominate. The Japanese force included 67 Heroes, 27 Vals, and 14 Kates with a unit of Bettys. Trailing behind by 154, action was joined. Montgomery cancelled his second strike and concentrated on the air battle for the first half-hour. Japanese dive bombers held sway, then came the torpedo planes. Some Bettys that missed the carrier task force found tip Merrill's cruisers instead and put a torpedo into light cruiser Denver, but that would be it. The Japanese strike groups lost a few Bettys, all of their Cake torpedo planes, and all but 10 of the Val dive bombers. The loss of several dozen attack planes in exchange for a single torpedo hit against a non-essential US warship measured Japan's decline in the year since Santa Cruz. The air battles of November 11 marked the effective end of Rabaul as a Japanese offensive base. Combined Fleet recalled Ozawa's Kido by aircraft the next day. The proud legions of the Sea Eagles were heavily thinned. Issued an imperial rescript congratulating the carrier and land-based airmen on their achievements. Only after the war would the Japanese discover how meager these had been, but the numbers tell their own story. 173 planes had gone to Rabaul, 53 returned to TRO. The losses included half the fighter planes, 85% of the dive bombers, 90% of the torpedo planes. Every single scout plane had been destroyed between damaged planes that had managed to land and airmen rescued. The personnel losses were not quite as bad. 50% of scout crews, 40% of the torpedo plane crews, 30% of the fighter pilots, but among the dive bomber crews, 3 of every 4 had perished. Fighter sorties were expensive but effective to some degree. Attack sorties were prohibitively costly regardless of their effectiveness, which was considerably less than the Imperial Navy believed. Admiral Kosaka, unable to protect major warships any longer, ordered them to TR. Captain Kato sailed with the Maya on November 12. The Agano also cleared harbor with some help, then was torpedoed en route by the American submarine Scamp. She had to be rescued by the Natori and her destroyers, which towed Captain Matsubara's ship the rest of the way. The Yubari was bombed at sea. Captain Ali Burke with his acclaimed destroyer squadron put the finishing touch on Japanese surface activity in the Battle of Cape St. George on November 25 when he annihilated 3 ships of a 5 destroyer Tokyo Express bound for Buer. Thanks to Ultra Admiral Hawley gave 31 not Burke 24 hours advance warning of the Imperial Navy's sally. Allied forces had achieved complete surface superiority from Rabaul. Admiral Kosaka continued to throw his 11th Air Fleet against Bonneville and New Guinea at enormous cost. JF losses in the Solomons for November 1943 are estimated at about 290 warplanes without the carrier aircraft. Kosaka's attacks were even less potent. His effort almost immediately suffered cutbacks once Nimitz opened his Central Pacific Drive on November 20, barely a week after the second Rabaul carrier attack. The pressures on JF's strength multiplied. Ironically, some of the last aerial reinforcements to Rabaul were planes drawn from Gent forces in the Marshalls and Gilberts, precisely where Nimitz struck, and the less experienced flyers added little to Kosaka's capability. While in return very soon the combined fleet withdrew. The 26th Air Flotilla, removing some of Kosaka's best air groups and reducing his serviceable strength to about 160 aircraft. Other reinforcements were composites, as in late December when the 3 ships of Carrier Division 1 each sent 7 fighters to augment the 253rd Air Group. That was the period of the largest JF defensive efforts, when formations of 72, 94 and even 98 fighters attempted to blunt the raids. The Japanese enjoyed a degree of success through the end of the year, while Kosaka did what he could. General MacArthur began to confect a siege ring surrounding the Big Good fortress, with Allied garrisons supporting air bases that kept up a constant rain of bombs. In December, MacArthur landed SPAC troops at Aral and Cape Gloucester at the western tip of New Britain for the first time, putting Allied troops on the same island as Rabaul. In January 1944, the target was the Green Islands to the east, which high captured using New Zealand troops at the air station planted there. Lieutenant Commander Richard Nixon served as a supply officer for the Soak Air Transport Command, his most substantive wartime assignment, and one for which he received a citation. Nixon is said to have been popular with the natives. The Cipro seized Amiro and Manus Islands west and north of Rabaul in March 1944, completing the encirclement. The war had reached a juncture where the Imperial Navy, even in its bases, could no longer be safe. For a Christmas present in 1943, Rabaul received another of Ted Sherman's carrier attacks shortly after the New Year. Fighter Ace Papy Boyington hit over the fortress had to ditch in St. George's Channel and would be rescued by Nyebo. The pilot was held prisoner at Rabaul for some weeks and then sent on to Japan by way of TR, in the meantime flying from the brand new U.S. airfield at Sterling in the Treasury Islands. Early in February, marine photoplanes took pictures of True. Admiral Koger viewed this as an omen of worse to come and sailed away with his combined fleet. Sure enough, on February 17th, True was subjected to a massive attack by the American Fast Carrier Task Force prisoner Boyington's air shuttle. From Rabaul landed. Amid this chaos, Boyington became an American witness to the demise of TR as a center of Japanese power. The Allied siege strategy was infinitely preferable to direct attack on Rabaul. By the time MacArthur completed his ring, the Japanese had had 2 years to fortify the place, and its defenses were formidable. The Japanese army had 76,500 troops in 2 infantry divisions, 2 brigades, an artillery brigade, and a tank regiment. Supporting weapons included 23 7 big guns or howitzers plus 8,875 mm cannons. Special naval landing forces contributed another dozen cannon, and the Navy had 38 coast defense guns, almost half of them 6 inches weapons. Caucus naval personnel amounted to 21,570 men, including 4 garrison units. And in SNLF, the forces possessed nearly 5,000 vehicles. There were 30,000 tons of ammunition and 45,000 tons of food. Stocks included roughly 2,900 tons of aviation gas and 3,600 tons of motor fuel. An invasion of Fortress Rabaul promised more heartache than anything ever done in the South Pacific. The reduction of Rabaul by means of aerial attack posed far fewer difficulties. This became the main function of Air Soles and the 13th Air Force. The air campaign began immediately after the carrier raids. During November, the 13th Air Force flew 41 sorties against Rabaul, but a month later the overall scale of Allied effort increased to 394 flights, and in January 1944 to 2,865. This was overwhelmingly an effort of the South Pacific forces. George Kenney sent exactly 9 airplanes to Rabaul from the time of his 5th Air Force raids through November 1944. Within Soak, Marine Corps airmen carried much of the burden. The height of the suppression campaign occurred between January and July 1944. It peaked in February when 4,552 sorties dumped 3,324 tons of munitions on the Japanese. To put that figure a different way, at this level of effort the Allies were hitting Rabaul with a 150-plane raid every day. Rain or shine, Marine Air flew more sorties against the fortress in every month except May, and its effort amounted to nearly 44% of the entire Allied tally. After April, the Rabaul missions were considered milk runs. Targeteers divided the town into more than a dozen sectors, and strikes tried to level them. Efforts to burn out the town were abandoned once photo interpreters determined that just 122 buildings were still standing, less than 10% of the town. Through July, Allied air forces delivered an average of more than 1,800 tons of bombs on Rabaul every month. From July 1944 through the end of the war, the Allies kept heads down with some hundreds of sorties each month. By the end of the war, the Allies had plastered Rabaul with 30,000 tons of munitions. The weight of that attack could not fail to have effects. In January 1944, Koga sent in the planes of Carrier Division 2, once more recalling some of the land-based air units. Shortly after the American carrier raid on True, the Japanese pulled out these planes plus the last of their 26th Air Flotilla. As many mechanics as possible left with them, and some more departed by submarine, or the few aircraft and blockade runners that sneaked in several hundred mechanics of the 751 Air Group crowded onto a pair of ships at Rabaul on February 20th. Its commander, Captain Sato, boarded an escorting subchaser. AOL's planes sank both the transports north of New Ireland. The next day, Sato's subchaser escaped Tog Nagara rescued. Number of survivors. She in turn was caught and sunk by Arie Burke's destroyers not far away. A day later, Burke's Little Beavers picked up about half the Japanese survivors, including more than 40 men of the 71st Group. Others drowned themselves or resisted capture. Rabaul was truly isolated. Operation Cartwheel had succeeded. After February, the JANF managed to field only a guerrilla air force, a handful of planes assembled from the boneyard patched together with parts from the wrecks that littered Rab's airfields. The Imperial Navy gave up trying to maintain Laconia Airfield in July 1944. Several other fields of the fortress complex fell into disrepair. Much earlier strenuous efforts kept Vanak Khana operational through the end of the war. It was last used on May 27, 1945, when the JANF slipped 2 bombers into Rabaul to stage a raid on Allied shipping in the Admiralties. Japanese soldiers and sailors went into farming, raising food to supplement their rations. The Emperor's expressed fears of brave men starving had proven prescient. Admiral Kosaka and General Imamura exerted themselves to buck up morale. The army had the best farms, and they graciously shared food with the Navy as fortress Rabaul declined to an isolated backwater left behind by a ferocious war. The Japanese Army and Imperial Navy finally achieved cooperation, so it was that the Solomon became the grave of Japan's dream. Here the pendulum of the Pacific War began to swing against Tokyo. The Battle of Midway robbed the Japanese of momentum and stripped their aura of invincibility, but after Midway the pendulum hung in balance. Japan retained numerical superiority and some distinct qualitative advantages. The dream was still attainable in the Solomons. The war was fought to a decision in the months beginning with July 1942. It remained open to the Japanese, more specifically to the Imperial Navy, to blunt Allied progress. Instead, Tokyo frittered away its forces in vain efforts to reverse, and then simply to halt accelerating adverse trends. The Japanese achieved momentary advantage at least twice, but each time squandered the opportunity. The Allies worked at a steady pace and eventually equaled, then surpassed their foe. The drama of the rise and fall of Fortress Rabaul encapsulates that progression. Japanese commanders believe they could fight in the Solomons on the cheap. A few men, please, and ships would suffice to control the outer South Seas. Once the Allies contested their dominance, the Solomons absorbed greater and greater Japanese attention until it became the main arena of confrontation. But Japan's devotion to the battle continued to suffer from a contradiction between the logic of its basic strategy and the expression of that in combat action, and also from a disconnect between the operations and the Imperial Navy's traditional battle doctrine. Not so the Allies. The United States, Australia, and New Zealand had no doubt the campaign was a matter of life or death, and no hesitation at a full measure of commitment. A multitude of factors help explain the outcome in the outer South Seas. Japanese expansion into the Solomons, first conceived as a protection for the empire, as Tokyo ran the board in the Pacific, became something much more when Tokyo's strategic planners began to think in terms of isolating or invading Australia. They were reframing the South Pacific as a major combat theater, yet they deployed no additional forces. The mismatch between strategy and force was a major error. Tokyo should have known the Allies would perceive Japan in the South Pacific as a threat. To leave the Solomons so sparsely held invited attack. Here Japan inserted a contradiction into its war strategy. It is important to bear in mind the dimensions of this conflict. To Japanese victory did not mean the defeat of the Allies, in particular the Americans, with its huge territory and enormous economy. The United States was impervious to capture by Japan. The same was true of the British Empire in coalition warfare. Alongside Germany and Italy, Tokyo might hope to fight the Allies to a standstill and force a negotiated termination of hostilities. Yamamoto's maxim about marching into Washington and dictating peace terms in the White House referred to this reality. Victory was bounded by the possible. Japanese leaders understood that the transcripts of the Imperial conferences before Pearl Harbor, the succession of meetings at which Japan decided on war, clearly show Tokyo believed its limited capabilities were just then at a maximum relative to those of the Allies. Leaders differed on how much leeway Japan possessed. Yamamoto Isoroka put the period of going wild at 6 months to a year. Nagano Osami felt the nation could fight for 3 years before ending hostility became a necessity. Distilled to its essence, this meant that to maintain the relative position of December 1941, the Japanese had to eliminate enough of the enemy to shave the margin by which Allied strength must increase. That represented an enormous task. The Japanese had a fair sense of Allied productive capacity and an exact knowledge of their own. Between December 1941 and June 1943, American shipyards delivered 4 new battleships, 2 heavy and 13 light cruisers, 6 fleet and 5 light carriers, 17 escort carriers, and 150 destroyers. Imperial Navy construction programs brought additions to the fleet as well through the end of 1943. These included 1 battleship, 2 fleet and 2 light carriers, 5 light escort carrier conversions, 4 light cruisers, and 24 destroyers. Japanese aircraft carrier deliveries, specifically the conversions, would actually have been fewer except for Midway, which convinced Japan to expedite carrier construction. As a rule of thumb, the Imperial Navy needed to eliminate 3 or 4 warships for each when it lost. That basic logic translates into a strategic necessity for an objective important enough to force the Allies to fight on Japanese terms. The Solomons became an arena of decision precisely because Yamamoto and his cohorts considered that their threat to Australia would pull the Allies into battle. Unlike Midway, however, where the Imperial Navy brought the weight of its forces to bear, the admirals resisted putting down chips commensurate with their stake. That failure created the most fundamental contradiction in Japanese strategy between its basic logic and the admiral's application of it. The Allied South Pacific and Southwest Pacific commands also waged war on a shoring at first, but Allied commanders could look ahead to a future of plenty once they passed the present of penury. SOC needed to do its best with what it had. One reason the Imperial Navy resisted making a proper correlation between the dimensions of strategy and the forces required to carry it out lay in traditional doctrine. For decades the Navy had planned, trained, and designed ships for a decisive battle, a very particular engagement in which Japan in a defensive mode would progressively weaken an advancing American fleet, and then face and destroy it in a single cataclysmic combat. This precise engagement concept was what Emperor Hito had referred to in speaking with military leaders at an August 1943 meeting. Carrying out such an action required husbanding naval power until the very eve of battle. The disconnect came between this approach to decisive battle versus the aim of preserving relative Japanese strength. Force was necessary to impose losses. The essence of traditional doctrine lay in withholding force, and that effectively conceded the initiative to the adversary, but an enemy with the initiative could choose not to engage until his military attained overwhelming superiority. Preserving relative strength, to the contrary, required an offensive posture, reversing the traditional direction of Japanese doctrine. Only on the offensive could the Imperial Navy compel the Allies to fight often enough and in sufficient strength to be whittled away. Historians and observers after the war who traced Japan's defeat to victory, disease in its essence, an unrelenting offensive posture, have neglected to think through the dimensions of the Japanese strategic problem. Although Imperial Navy officers were overconfident, the truth is that Japan's basic policy required that stance. More useful is to question the assumptions in Japan's decision for war that the basic policy could be carried out in the real world and that the Imperial Navy could adapt to the different requirements of this strategy. Admiral Yamamoto was the man best suited to shake the fleet out of its high doctrine and endow it with an offensive posture, and he did accomplish that to a considerable degree. The Pearl Harbor attack first broke the old decisive battle mold. The Midway Plan was another attempt to compel the adversary to action when the Navy General Staff and Combined Fleet wrestled with their FS operation and the Australia isolation schemes. The South Pacific Dream. They were furthering this enterprise, but Yamamoto himself, not just his peers, had been steeped in traditional doctrine and inclined to husband the fleet. He short-changed the Solomons. Japan set the stage for the arena of decision without putting enough props in place. The unraveling of Japanese strategy began All of this is not to say that the Allies themselves were powerful, supple, or united in their own approach marines. On Guadalcanal were quite right to consider themselves on a shoring in the outer South Seas. The Japanese were weak. By choice, the Allies of necessity. What made the Solomons an arena of decision was precisely that narrow margin. Which brings us to intelligence. The pillars of intelligence made enormous contributions in the Solomons. Take away code breaking, and there would still have been an Allied advantage in combination with the insight into Japanese operations and preparations enabled thin Allied forces to meet the Imperial Navy on equal or superior terms time after time. Intelligence was not omniscient. Mistakes have been noted with respect to Japanese fleet movements and losses, and coverage was lost from time to time as the Japanese changed codes or procedures, but on those occasions the other pillars helped fill the gap. Aerial reconnaissance and the coast watchers would have been formidable even without together. They came as close to eliminating the fog of war as can be imagined. The decrypts that enabled American aircraft to ambush Admiral Yamamoto by themselves probably ensured that would be graded positively. But there is a good argument that the nickel and diamond contributions of intelligence actually overshadow the Yamamoto shoot-down in the Solomon arena. It became impossible for a Japanese ship or plane to execute a mission unopposed despite the Allies' at first inferior forces. This led to disruptions of tempo, frustration of Tokyo's aims, and a succession of air and naval battles. Since Allied units were individually of high quality, the Imperial Navy got no free ride, and the accumulating losses rendered impossible its larger goal of whittling at Allied strength. In addition to the simple destruction of units, the Japanese were obliged to accept virtual attrition, the diversion of warships and aircraft to missions other than combat. Every destroyer used as a transport, every submarine hauling supplies, every bomber shuttling food packets was a unit taken out of the line of battle. Intelligence made both direct and indirect contributions to Allied success. In recent years it has become fashionable to speak of intelligence as a force multiplier. The Solomons campaign shows very concretely how that worked. Intelligence proved better at some things than at others, undoubtedly. The biggest Allied intelligence failure of the campaign lay in misinterpreting the import of the Japanese operations that evacuated Guadalcanal. Fortunately, that miscarriage occurred at a point when the strategic initiative had shifted to the Allies. The Japanese success had little influence on the progress of the campaign. The failure is overshadowed by greater successes. What if the Japanese had broken the American codes? Multipliers work on both sides of an equation. The Japanese did have some success with low-grade Allied codes, and they developed the same pillars of intelligence. Their radio traffic analysis was very good, but neither the Imperial Navy nor the Japanese Army developed intelligence networks as extensive as those of the Allies, and for the Japanese intelligence does not seem to have carried the same weight or credibility as it did for Nimitz-Hawley or MacArthur. Had the Japanese had a code penetration equivalent to JN2, it is not clear that this advantage would have equivalent impact. In particular, the Japanese lacked a radio interception network as immense as the Allied one without the requisite large volume of enemy messages to work with. The Japanese would have had difficulty maintaining their entry into the codes. The most reasonable conclusion is that the Japanese might potentially have scored some spectacular like the Midway or Yamamoto breaks, but would not have attained the degree of penetration required to inflict virtual attrition. Allied intelligence would have retained the edge. The point of intelligence is still to inform the men and women at the tip of the spear. Battle is the payoff. In the Solomons arena, each side had advantages, some quite important technological developments infused Allied forces with capabilities vital to success. Radar and other electronics were nearly as important as intelligence. Introduced for early warning, radar was adapted to guide fighter interception, make night fighting practical on the sea and in the air, facilitate navigation, and finally to guide the gunners at their bloody work. Encryption devices improved and miniaturized radios, amphibious ships, proximity fuses, high-endurance gun barrels, PT boats, and the warships' combat information center were important technological innovations. The atomic bomb was a game-changer but is outside our scope here. Given the prowess of the American scientific establishment, it is embarrassing that throughout this period the United States proved unable to produce torpedoes that worked within excellent torpedo plane in the TBF Avenger as late as the Rabble raids of November 1943. Only 2 torpedoes of more than 50 expended actually functioned properly. Aeronautical design proved a key technological area early on. The Japanese had an important advantage with their Zero fighter. American aircraft designers met the Japanese first with nearly equal or slightly superior warplanes like the F-4F Wildcat and the P-38 Lightning, but then they deluged the adversary with superior designs: the F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, and the P-47 Thunderbolt, to name only the most prominent. With its huge industrial capacity and talented engineering community, the United States had a major advantage. 4 of these 5 aircraft were introduced during the Solomons campaign. In that interval, Japan barely got its new fighters past the prototype stage. The innovations that reached the field were largely modifications to existing designs, but the Allies did plenty of that kind of tinkering as well. Much less known were innovations that played a direct role in making rapid amphibious advance possible. Already at Guadalcanal, Soke had landed landing craft designed to put men on shore. These were followed by a variety of larger and specialized landing craft and ships to carry tanks, trucks, bulldozers, and heavy equipment direct from embarkation ports and deposit them on invasion beaches. The LST, or landing ship tank, was based on a British design and introduced toward the end of 1942. Some of the later Solomons invasions, such as Renovaville, the Treasury Islands, and Bonneville, were carried out importantly or even exclusively by LSTs, knowing a good thing when they saw it. The Japanese produced their own versions starting in 1943. Specialized amphibious assault ships like the LSD landing ship Dock were in use before the end of the campaign. The Solomons educated the U.S. Navy in amphibious operations, developing a professionalism applied in every subsequent invasion from the Central Pacific to Normandy to the Philippines. American industry furnished large numbers of these craft to the field forces in a short time because the Solomons campaign proved to be all about airfields. Next to specialized amphibious vessels, the most important element was professionalized construction and combat engineering units. The efforts of the CBS were vital to keeping Henderson Field in action during the very first battle. Without them, the Japanese naval and air bombardments would have been successful. CBS and Army engineers multiplied the bases available to the Cactus Air Force and made possible its dominance over the slot. The construction teams perfected their techniques to such a degree that airfields were built on Renova in just over 2 weeks, and at Carina and Bonneville in little over a month. Those and similar airfields became bases for the siege of Fortress Rebel. Conversely, Japanese difficulties at airbase construction substantially increased the vulnerability of Imperial Navy surface forces and the cost of Japanese air operations. Starting with Guadalcanal, the Japanese had a fully articulated base network at the outset of the campaign. The inadequacies of their aircraft designs would have mattered less had the Japanese air umbrella extended from Lair Point and Munda rather than Rabaul. The invasion would have cost the Allies dearly and come nearer to fulfilling Tokyo's strategy even with the Cactus Air Force implanted at Henderson. Japanese aircraft at Munda would have posed a much greater threat, and the expert pilots would have survived in greater numbers. The JNF airfield at Guadalcanal neared completion in roughly 6 weeks. When eventually built, Munda took about the same. The fields of the Bonneville complex were built in 6 to 8 weeks. Tokyo's engineers improved their efficiency but never matched the CBS. The larger question is one of aerial superiority. Basic to Tokyo's goal, aircraft attrition drove the equation. During the Solomons campaign, the Imperial Navy lost 1,467 fighters and 1,199 torpedo or dive bombers or land-based bombers. Fighters always get the attention, but JNF's strike capability resided in its attack forces. Losses among the attack groups reached the point where massive numbers of fighters were being sent off with tiny numbers of bombers. Japanese strike capabilities became inadequate to inflict significant damage. There was no escaping this vicious circle given the increasing Allied stranglehold in the air and the technical proficiency of its naval forces. It is a tribute to the skill and bravery of Imperial Navy sailors as well as the quality of its own ships that the Japanese were able to accomplish as much as they did until very late in the campaign. Its specialized equipment, techniques, and intensive training enabled the Imperial Navy to hold its own, fighting at night against an Allied fleet in growing numbers and with technological sophistication. So long as the Japanese retained that margin, they remained dangerous in spite of Allied air power. Whenever the surface fleets came to grips, that practical superiority evaporated in the Central Solomons. When Allied tactics matched the Japanese technology, provided an edge, and the Imperial Navy's heavy ships, so jealously hoarded, fought at a serious disadvantage once the Japanese became inferior on the surface as well as in the air. There remained no obstacle to the swing of the pendulum. The event horizon proved a true phenomenon in contrast to the period up through the isolation of Fortress Rabble, when Imperial Navy sailors exacted an Allied toll almost ship for ship between the end of 1943 and Japan's surrender in 1945. Allied losses became minimal, Japanese ones enormous. Some commentary regarding individuals and situations is also appropriate. The most important concerns Admiral Yamamoto. What if he had not fallen victim to aerial ambush? Had Yamamoto survived, it seems likely the Japanese would have concluded their codes were being read. He had paid close attention to radio deception activities in several fleet engagements, and having received the warnings he did before that Bonneville visit, Yamamoto would have been compelled to pay attention. On the other hand, Yamamoto's continued command might not have been very detrimental from the Allied point of view. The Japanese admiral was capable of mistakes. Midway being the obvious example, he was also prepared to rely upon tired officers like Kondo Nitak, and that too was to Allied advantage. By April 1943, the pendulum had swung irretrievably to the Allies. There seems little Yamamoto could have done to reverse that. Perhaps he could have forced an early abandonment of the Solomons before the last great dissipation of Japanese strength, but the attitude of the High Command would seem to argue against Tokyo's giving up the game at that time. On the American side, Chester W. Nimitz, a superb leader of men, made a huge difference to Allied efforts. Nimitz listened to subordinates, gave leeway to his intelligence people, integrated their reporting into his battle plans, and provided the example that others followed to victory. His finely honed notion of calculated risk made the difference in several important battles. With good sense, flexibility, and patience, Nimitz held the line in the fall of 1942 when Allied commanders in the South Pacific might have inclined to panic. The SN Pac's willingness to commit extra carriers to soak for repeat strikes on Rabble a year later, even with the timing so close to his Central Pacific offensive, is characteristic of his aggressive pursuit of success. Nimitz and Yamamoto were well-suited adversaries. One of Nimitz's strengths, his loyalty to subordinates, while in general a desirable trait, could be detrimental if the people he protected were not pulling their weight. This was the case with Admiral Robert Gormley. The first soak Gormley's detached method, his diffidence, and his indecisiveness failed to energize the South Pacific Command at a key time. Nimitz left him in place too long, but the SN Pac selection of William F. Hawley as Gormley's successor was excellent. Aggressive to a fault, an inspirational leader, Hawley was the very tonic soak needed had Gormley remained in command. The aftermath of the Battle of Santa Cruz might have turned out quite differently. Another officer Nimitz protected was Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. The SN Pac appreciated Fletcher's experience as a carrier commander while apparently discounting his excessive caution. Fortunately, a cadre of new carrier commanders, including Mark Mitchell of soak fame, but also such others as Raymond Spruance and Bill Hawley himself, were coming to the fore and making it unnecessary to employ Fletcher. Admiral Nimitz served within a command structure that was supportive, though not without its faults. The Allied High Command successfully integrated strategy with operational control, furnished good logistical support, and provided for excellent intelligence. It adjudicated disputes between theater commands, such as those between Nimitz and MacArthur. President Roosevelt managed with a very light hand, intervening only very occasionally. Emperor Hito actually seems to have concerned himself more directly with military activities, but was hampered by the constraints of court etiquette as well as the rigidity of the High Command, which reflected the semi-feudal clan origins, fierce independence, and jealous prerogatives of the Japanese Armed Services inter-service cooperation. and joint planning remained distant dreams, while the service's sense of ownership, as in the allocation and control of merchant shipping, actually created obstacles to efficient military operations and even the expansion of the war economy. All that was magnified by the limited resources available to Imperial Japan. Jealous military and naval satrapies underestimated the dimensions of the Allied threat to the Solomons, exaggerated their capability to deal with the adversary, concealed their weaknesses from one another, and minimized the requirements of an extended campaign in the outer South Seas. The Japanese High Command had two major moments of opportunity during the Solomons campaign. The first took place at and following the Battle of Saw Island. If Frank Fletcher had stayed at Guadalcanal and engaged with the aggressiveness of a High or a Mitre Saville, would not have been an enemy victory. If Fletcher had even pursued the retreating Mawa with any energy, Saville could at least have been a Mexican standoff. The Allies' salvation lay in the Japanese not being prepared for the watchtower landings and dismissing the Americans on Guadalcanal as raiders. The Japanese did not follow through on the logic of their own policy. This is especially puzzling in the aftermath of Midway, since the critical losses there put the Imperial Navy on notice that its margin of superiority had much diminished. If Midway had been a failed decisive battle afterward, the need was a devoir to get it right. Yamamoto's formula of running wild required that anything else meant handing over a discrete portion of advantage every day to a certain degree. This fault can be traced to the peculiarity of Imperial General Headquarters, a joint command of independent FOMs, not really a common leadership at all. But the truth is also that the Imperial Navy was slow to appreciate that the Solomons could be its arena of decision and loath to flood the theater with its forces. The Japanese could perfectly well have begun constructing an airfield at Munda in August 1942 rather than December, and that would have made a huge difference in, say, October. Though bound by their decisive battle doctrine, oddly enough, the Japanese did not follow that logic either. Once Imperial forces engaged at Guadalcanal, the Navy enmeshed itself in a succession of actions to control the sea and air off that place. The constant drain of losses among the light units beset by the Cactus Air Force and Soak-Scratch battle groups induced Yamamoto and his fleet commanders to feed in their heavy ships in order to achieve results. This flew in the face of the husbanding presupposed by doctrine, yet even the heavy units did not solve the Guadalcanal supply problem, in some measure due to effective Allied intelligence, and mounting frustration led to accepting ever greater risks. Mutual attrition the Imperial Navy could not afford, and this was even truer of air forces than of the surface fleet. Yet every day made it clearer that aerial superiority had become prerequisite to any other action. Japan's second great opportunity came with the Battle of Santa Cruz, and in the weeks thereafter. This time the Japanese had generated their forces and prepared for the fight, but they failed to prepare for exploitation at that critical moment. The fault was Yamamoto's. He appreciated the situation and hastened to throw forces at Cactus, but still did not fully commit, sending home his best aircraft carrier and planning new offensives far in the future. The days lost afforded Hawley the chance to regroup, and the Japanese Army's inability to generate offensive traction on Guadalcanal completed the failure, while Allied intelligence ultra especially contributed every day to the success of Soak operations. Arguably it rendered its greatest service in the 5 weeks or so from Santa Cruz to Tassafaronga. During that interval Hawley's legion stood on a knife's edge. Cactus might yet have been isolated, as Rabaul would be later. H's inferior surface forces could have been swept from the sea, and his single weakened aircraft carrier overwhelmed from the sky. Intel enabled Hawley to block the enemy that the High Fleet did not always succeed. Tassafaronga being a notable calamity is no reflection on the pillar's performance. Yamamoto's error in planning for the future rather than acting in the moment stood revealed before the end of the year, when the Japanese on Guadalcanal had become so starved they were incapable of offensive action in any event, and by which time Allied naval forces had begun to grow powerful. Careful Japanese offensive plans had to be scrapped in favor of ones to save the men on Starvation Island. By then major Japanese air operations yielded small effects. The attrition of Japanese air in turn made ground and naval sallies increasingly ineffective. Hawley's South Pacific Command first inched up the slot, then advanced at an accelerating pace. Allied Intelligence still furnished key information: its failure to detect the Japanese evacuation from Guadalcanal. These balanced if not eclipsed by the ultra breakthrough on the Yamamoto ambush, but as Soak's raw power grew, the value of secret information diminished. Intelligence continued to multiply force, but by a lesser factor, although it had a last great contribution still to make: the secret knowledge that led to the slaughter of the Imperial Navy heavy ships that rabbled the logic of the Japanese approach would be completely vitiated after Guadalcanal, when the focus turned from whittling down the adversary to force protection. The decisive battle doctrine had prevailed. Suddenly the Japanese rarely committed big ships, never their battleships, and sent carrier air groups to fly from land bases, never their flat tops. The Imperial Navy's light forces, already addled by virtual attrition, were left unsupported against an increasingly capable and technologically sophisticated Soak fleet. So deplorable did the situation become that a robust staff officer publicly remonstrated with his superiors for the high command's attitude. 40 Imperial Navy destroyers were lost in the Solomons campaign. More than a third of its pre-war strength. New construction did not make good those losses. The Americans in all theaters also had 40 destroyers sunk to the end of 1943, but added 200. The Japanese fleet, so carefully husbanded for decisive battle, lacked escort protection when it did emerge. When Admiral Koga finally sent in the heavy ships, they suffered a Pearl Harbor in reverse. Soon after that, Fortress Rabaul itself became powerless against the Allied aerial armada. From Pearl Harbor to Rabaul, the war had gone full circle in just under 2 years. The rapidity with which the Solomons transformed from arena to backwater is a measure of Allied triumph and Japanese failure. There would be no Japanese dictation of terms at the White